Well, thanks for having me. I want to at least start with the idea that we have students here, we have graduates here. Johns Hopkins has done a ton of things for us, either helping with our students or bringing them in for rotations, hiring them. I get given all kinds of goodies that are just surpluses, and we live and die by that stuff. So our program really does appreciate the relationship we have with Hopkins, and we thank you guys that are watching on this, and everybody that has anything to do with our students. We really appreciate it. Any of you in the core that are in hematology, we need some ALL slides, so I'll go ahead and take that pitch as well, that we need some ALL. But those are the kinds of things that help us out tremendously, and we just don't know how grateful we are for it. So when Chris asked me to come today to talk about lab safety, and I kind of asked her what the context was, and we got into a conversation that you have a CQI group, CQI, is that right? That looks for, after CAP inspections, areas where there could be improvement, where people might not need to get some reminders of things that you already know. And one of the things that was identified was lab safety stuff, and this is going to be kind of a back to basics talk, in the sense that I feel a little bit like that I'm telling you how to put your pants on one leg at a time in some of this, but we're going to just try to do some things that just kind of elevate lab safety in your workplace right now. So I'm going to start with an odd question, which is, where do most car accidents happen? And 52% occur within a 5-mile radius from home. And if you look at a 10-mile radius, 69% of car accidents happen within a 10-mile radius of home. And drilling down to what the most common causes are, number one is driver error. And if you drill into driver error, what's the biggest cause of that error? And it's distraction. And that's probably not real big news to you. But what does this have to do with laboratory accidents? And it's because human beings in the car and the laboratory are still human beings. We still tend to make the same things, that do the same things wrong and right. So most accidents in the laboratory really do happen during routine operations when people are either rushing or they're distracted. They've kind of lost their fear of the idea that, oh my gosh, that might be blood from an AIDS patient. My son, God love his heart, is freaked out by all things medical. And the thought of having a HIV positive blood in front of him just sends him into palpitations. Yeah, I lost that, if I ever had that, years and years ago. So there's a certain amount of complacency, distraction, because there's a lot of things going on, including just having a student with you, that instead of doing your regular job, you've got a student with you as well. And rushing, sometimes even beyond what the situation requires, we'll talk about that a little bit. And failure to follow established procedures, so things that we know, but maybe are cutting a few corners because we're in a hurry. So based on what the CQI team found, we're going to do just a little bit of back to basics, and I'm just interested in making sure that you're reinvigorated by some of these topics, as opposed to that, oh wow, this is really deep, new information she's presenting. So we're just going to review kind of quickly some of those things. And then I want to introduce to you an idea of the safety culture, which I think might be a little bit of a new concept for you guys, but something that you might want to consider happening here at Hopkins. And I think you've got a little bit of that with your CQI team already. So this is from the CDC, and when you're approaching a task for safety, the most important thing to do, if you can, is just eliminate the hazard altogether. So that if you're doing a procedure and the chemical that you're using is extremely hazardous, if you can substitute that hazardous chemical for a non-hazardous chemical, then that's an elimination, and that's the best way to go about containing a hazard. So elimination, substitution. Engineering controls mean you're isolating people from the hazard. So a chemical fume hood, for example, is a way that you're isolating people from the chemicals. Administrative controls are things like changing the way people work. So let's say you have a very, very hazardous procedure and you have a person working alone at night doing that procedure all alone with nobody else around. Well, clearly that doesn't make any sense. So if this is really hazardous, you want to put that person on day shift when there are other people around and something goes wrong. So just changing the way that people do things to make it more safe. And then if all of that fails, personal protective equipment. And in the hospital, we've got a big failure of a lot of those things. We can't get rid of HIV positive blood. We can't get rid of chemicals. We can't get rid of those things. And once you start with personal protective equipment, you have acknowledged we've eliminated all the hazards we can, and now we're having to put a barrier on the person. So we're going to start with personal protective equipment. And this should be something that comes down mostly from on high, from people who have assessed the kind of procedure that you're doing. Is there going to be splashing, aerosols, sharps, and so forth? Now, again, with the approach of a CQI team, if there's splashing in a procedure, the first thing you do is try to eliminate the splashing. You don't figure out how to give somebody a really good splash guard first. Your first task is to try to eliminate it. But assuming we can't, what's the degree of risk? What's the chemicals? What are the biohazards? Condition of the worker. Is this person pregnant, immunocompromised, needing more personal protective equipment perhaps? And then there's an SOP established, the standard operating procedure. So for example, most places have decided, based on this assessment, that if you're processing specimens, you need a lab coat on that's fully buttoned up, you need gloves and some sort of splash protection, and that then becomes the standard of protection for everyone. And that's then becomes kind of non-negotiable once that assessment has been made. So I want to make a few comments about personal protective equipment. Generally, it needs to fit properly. So that means it's incumbent upon you. If gloves don't fit, if they're too tight or too loose, or the lab coats that you're provided, one size fits all sometimes is not only uncomfortable, sometimes it's not safe. So that if there is something to do with the compliance with some of the personal protective equipment because it doesn't fit, you've got to speak up about that. Generally, there's an order of putting on protective equipment, and the gloves go on last so that you can have enough dexterity to put the other things on. And I'm going to run quickly through this because I understand that for most people in the Corps this is not an issue. But it is important to think about how you take off your PPE, including gloves. And one of the things that you need to do when taking gloves off is to make sure that you're not putting your nice clean hand on a dirty glove. So that idea, and everybody's seen this before probably, where you take the one glove off and crunch it in your hand, and then you slide your fingers underneath so that you're only clean to clean, flip it inside out, and so that's the proper way to take off gloves. There are similar things for how to take off lab coats, and CDC has something similar to this. So if you are in a situation where you need gloves, gown, so forth, to try to put those on in the proper order, and the gloves have priority over almost everything because typically that's the dirtiest part of you, where you've been doing the work that you've been doing. Should you need to have eyeglasses or splash protection, anything that doesn't have side shield is considered unacceptable. Goggles with a seal around your eyes, if you truly need eye protection, are considered better. Just for a lot of people that wear prescription eyewear, a lot of folks would like to think that that's sufficient. It's not, so if you truly have a splash concern, then you may need to use those eyeglasses and splash guards over your prescription glasses, because not any prescription glasses that I know of have the side shields or the top piece. And you can see those glasses up there have not only just the side shield, but also a top piece. I know there are a few UVs and laser around here. There are special lenses for that. If you're not aware of it, please never look at those directly. I don't, even with the special glasses, I'm not too fond of looking at UV and lasers either. So in specimen processing, just curious, everybody who does the full face shield, is that how you're doing specimen processing for splash protection? Okay, just curiosity. Or working behind a splash guard. Behind a splash guard, okay. Folks, contact lenses are very popular. When you're working with hazards though, contact lenses are a special category of hazard. Liquids get trapped under that contact lens. And that actually, if you can't get the contact lens out quickly, causes more damage than if you just splash somebody's bare eye. Why? Because it's trapped underneath the contact lens. And your own tears and your own normal mechanism for clearing the hazard out are actually impaired when it's stuck underneath the contact lens. And you can cause scarring where the contact lens actually is adhered to the eye and you can't get it off easily because of whatever damage has been done. So there's a couple layers of this. Of course, OSHA says if you can avoid wearing contact lenses at all, don't do it. Well, of course, you know, who wants to do that if you like your contact lenses? But there are some procedures that forbid them just because of the hazard that's in place. But the other message is that if you're gonna wear contact lenses and you do have an accident, that needs to be a priority to get them out. Obviously, you're gonna run to the eye wash, obviously, you're gonna try to wash your eyes, but getting that contact lens out is an additional priority for you, where somebody else might just be flushing their eye. So after all of that, probably the big topic here is gloves. There are three major materials that gloves you would contact with typically that protect against biohazard: latex, nitrile, and vinyl. I did have a chat with Chris to try to make sure I geared this talk to what Hopkins is doing, and my understanding is you're latex-free institution now. And that's because a lot of places have done this because of the allergy risks to latex. However, the nitrile and the vinyl are not perfect. They're not as stretchy as the latex. They tend to make holes faster than the latex does. And they may not be chemically resistant, and the latex may not either. So neoprene and other substances are the chemical resistant ones, and they probably know this a little bit better than you do up in where they're doing chemotherapy on the cancer ward, because those chemo drugs can penetrate certain kinds of gloves. So for most glove materials, you can get a chemical penetration profile. So if you're doing a procedure with a chemical and you are concerned, is this okay with the nitrile or the vinyl or whatever it is, it's pretty easy to get the chemical penetration profile for these materials. And like the contact lens, if you have a penetration of that glove, you now have the chemical that's being held against your skin. So it's being essentially pressed in as opposed to just kind of a normal splash. So when you do have a glove penetration, that is actually a pretty big deal. Insulated gloves for hot and cold, and people that work in autoclaves and so forth. And then if you're doing animal research, obviously puncture-resistant gloves, which I think happens around here. Now, related to gloves, if you went to Bath and Body Works and got yourself a really nice smelling hand lotion, good for you. However, there are many of those kinds of hand lotions that are petroleum-based and will dissolve the gloves. They will start to make the gloves compromised. So when you see those lotions that say, formulated for healthcare use or whatever the words are, the reason is that the base of those lotions doesn't dissolve the gloves. And I don't mean dissolve like all of a sudden you look and it's gone. It's just starting to compromise the material so that stuff could penetrate. So it is a good idea if you want to use hand lotion, and by the way, I support that fully, because if you wash your hands a lot or use that alcohol a lot, you really need to. So having some sort of, and you can see a brand there that I just threw up, but there are some specially formulated for use in healthcare. Those would be something that you would consider. One of the things that I do is always just take my rings and stuff off before I use my gloves. You can see the ring there penetrating the glove, and I really can't work in gloves very long with my jewelry on. It just doesn't work very well. So if that is a problem for you, consider not wearing your jewelry. In addition to the penetrating the glove, it also, even with hand washing, tends to harbor hazards and microorganisms. And it just sort of makes sense. If you're washing your hands, the stuff that's underneath your rings and around your rings probably doesn't get as clean as just your plain old skin does. So from that standpoint as well, just keeping that jewelry off your hands is a really good idea. And oh, by the way, there have been studies, the artificial nails and chipped nail polish, that if you have nail polish on and it's really chipped, that also harbors microorganisms. Now, I'm not suggesting that any supervisor should run around and look at your fingers and tell you to get a manicure, but just from a safety standpoint and hand hygiene, keeping your nails short and trimmed and without the nail polish usually is much better. This is another photo I picked up off the internet. Those really sharp nails. I don't know how you wear gloves with that. That would make me crazy. But those kinds of things actually can cause problems. Now, the idea of the gloves needing to be changed about 30 minutes or every 30 minutes or so, we'll get to in just a second. And you probably know that you don't reuse them. Chris had asked me for some references on a couple of the topics, and this is right here, and I've emailed her the PowerPoint, so if somebody wants to read this reference, a really nice study of this guy who studied the different materials that gloves are made of and measured how long it took for them to dissolve with hand lotion and the HIV virus to penetrate and so forth. So it's a really nice study that he did that is the basis of a lot of what I'm saying. Do note that glove materials can be compromised. The latex is probably worse than the vinyl and the nitrile, but exposure to light and UV, heat, humidity, ozone, and if you think about heat and humidity, the biggest source of heat and humidity for a glove is your sweaty hand inside of it. And so the longer you're wearing your gloves and your own sweat and your own salts and so forth are on that glove, the more you're going to have that glove starting to be compromised. These are temporary PPE. They're not designed to be worn on an 8-hour shift. So that in the study that I just cited, it took about 50 minutes for HIV and HBV to be able to penetrate gloves that had been worn by hot, sweaty hands, and that's kind of the source of the changing them roughly every 30 minutes or so. Now, if you have, probably doesn't apply to you guys at all. It applies to me more because I'm in a teaching lab. We date the boxes toward the end of the semester because if they sit 3 months for the whole summer, they're getting old. And we have had some gloves get kind of funky. They've been open for a while. So this is just kind of a reminder that if there's a box of gloves that's been sitting somewhere and you think, oh, I didn't know that was back there, and they feel kind of crunchy, pitch them. Because a lot of people don't think of gloves as something that can age out, and they age out faster once they've been opened. So if you're in a spot that you want to date that box when it's open, I wouldn't lose my mind dating things because you probably go through boxes and boxes in a shift, so I get that. Now, having said all that, you can get allergies to personal protective equipment, one of the reasons why the latex has really gone away, as well as allergies to chemicals and other things that you are encountering. So that it is important for you to recognize what those signs and symptoms might be, because you should report them. It would be considered an occupational exposure potentially, and it would be something that the administration would want to know about. So if you have a particular brand of gloves or a brand of soap or a brand of hand lotion or whatever, and you've got people reacting to it, and you probably don't want that in your place anymore. They're not going to know unless you say so. So some of the signs can include runny noses and eyes and itching, rashes, hives, swelling, difficulty breathing, and people in an extreme, at the extreme end can get asthma, go into shock, and even die. So you need treatment if that's what it is. They need to investigate, and it may be something else in your life. It might not be occupational exposure at all, but as soon as I've had students that have had allergies, and they come, something's wrong with my hands, and you can just see it, like from there down, everything's red, from there up, everything's fine. Well, clearly that's a problem with the glove that we need to do something with. So just a reminder that that's incumbent upon you to tell folks. Now, when the gloves come off, you need to still hand wash or perform hand hygiene. And I'm going to tell you a very short story to convince you that you need to learn not just how to wash your hands, but the proper way to wash your hands. In 1996, there were 19 microbiology staff in a place that shall remain nameless, although I think it's on the CDC website, and they all got Shigella sonnei. Now, that particular organism, if you look at the ordinary infection rate in microbiology labs, it's 0.84 cases per 1,000 person years, and you had 6 people all at once come down with the Shigella. So clearly something monumental happened in that particular case. So what led up to this happening? Well, there was a hand washing sink that some genius thought was really good to move adjacent to the workbench. So moved it from wherever it was, and also decided that the foot pedals on the sink were too expensive to maintain, let's put hand faucets in. So probably what you had was a microbiology staff that was used to the foot pedals and not really used to the hand things and thinking about that. And when they drilled down into the Shigella isolate that these people had, it was all the same strain, so it was absolutely identical, and they went back, and sure enough, there was a clinical isolate that matched that exact strain that had been handled adjacent to that sink in a couple days before. So the conclusion was that probably the staff touched the dirty handles and after they had washed their hands. So let's talk about hand washing, and this is, again, one of those topics I feel like that I'm telling you how to put your pants on one leg at a time. However, reminder that it has to occur whether you've been wearing gloves or not. It is actually surprising to know that the FDA has established an acceptable defect rate for gloves. So the defect rate should be 0, right? Everybody believes that. But you also know that in food service and other places, they have a certain amount of parts per million that rat droppings can be in our food and junk like that. So perfection is pretty hard to achieve. So for the non-surgical gloves, so the sort of medical grade gloves that you wear, the acceptable defect rate is about 2.5%, which is, okay, 98% of the gloves you pick up are fine, but 2% seems like a lot to me. If you wear gloves a lot, that seems like a lot. So if we kind of do a little math and say that let's assume sweat can compromise gloves in 50 minutes or so, and we decide to change our gloves every 30 minutes, that means that in an 8-hour shift, at least once you've had defective glove on your hand. So that is a fairly high risk rate to me in terms of thinking that your gloves are going to protect you. Therefore, this idea of really needing to make sure that or believe that even though you've been wearing gloves, your hands are contaminated is a smart one. So you remove those gloves the way I said so that you're not further contaminating your hand, but you're assuming the gloves were penetrated, so you're going to do some sort of hand hygiene, either an alcohol rub, or hand washing. Now the sink should be assumed to be a clean sink, but when you go to touch those handles, you have to assume those handles are dirty. You just pulled the gloves off your hands. I've told you that your hands might be dirty. Now you're putting your hands on the handles, and somebody else did too, so make the assumption that those handles are dirty. Wet your hands, use whatever hospital-approved soap is there, and washing your hands for at least 1 minute is a good idea. Anybody ever remember being in daycare, taking a kid to daycare, and they have to stand at the sink and sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star twice, or they have to say the alphabet? So you sing whatever ditty in your head you want to try to keep you standing there. There have been lots of studies of watching people wash their hands in public restrooms, and the average time was less than 10 seconds. And I'm probably just as guilty of it. So you've probably got some hospital-approved soap that's a disinfecting soap. Use that. Sing Star Spangled Banner or whatever you need to do in your head. Turn off the water with the paper towel. So take your paper towel to dry your hands, and then use those paper towels to turn off the handles. And it's really quite just that simple to make sure that you're not recontaminated. I made my children do that in public restrooms, and they were so embarrassed. Mom, you're not allowed. It's like so embarrassed. And I would say to them, no, don't touch those handles. And they just thought that that was the most humiliating thing in the world, that I wouldn't let them do it. I think public restroom, you need to go take microbiology. If you think you want to touch that, no. And then hand cream to prevent chapping if that's your jam. I'm assuming that there's very clearly labeled clean sinks and contaminated sinks. They shouldn't be crossed. So hand washing sinks really should be dedicated just to that. These are just some lovely photographs of the gram stain sink down there at the bottom, and then our clean sink doesn't look so clean, but that's where we wash our hands because it's old sink. Now, alcohol gels. The only time you're allowed to use alcohol gels is if your hands are not visibly contaminated. As soon as you have drops of blood or some sort of debris on your hand that's visibly soiled, you need to wash it. The alcohol gels are not good at penetrating debris. So if there's actual blood, if there's actually something, all the protein that's in that, so you gotta go wash that off. However, if you have gloves and nothing that's been particularly unusual, alcohol gels are fine, with a couple of caveats. A lot of folks, because alcohol gels are sold to consumers and they're everywhere, think that, okay, this must be pretty safe. But a reminder that those alcohol vapors actually are at a very, very low flash point. There's enough alcohol vapor that is wafting off of your hand, and they've had people in healthcare systems get burned because their hands were still too wet, the alcohol was wafting off, and they've gone to switch on a light, or they've gone to do something that had just enough spark, and they had their hand erupt into little tiny flames from the alcohol gel, and that's happened more than once. So just be aware that it is still it's a tiny fire hazard. You're not going to burn the building down, but I bet your hand's not going to feel too good for a little while. Use the minimal amount of gel, and typically what that means is that if you're on a dispenser system, that the hospital dispenser systems are giving you enough with one squirt, so you don't have to do 15 squirts. That's typically enough. Make sure that you then let it air dry before you do anything else. And I'm, again, guilty of that. I'm like this, and then I'm on to 15 other things, but just remember that. If this is probably more relevant to microbiology, but I'll at least make sure that you guys know this. It doesn't work against infectious organisms called prions. It doesn't work against a lot of the spore-forming organisms. And examples of that are Bacillus anthracis, and we don't see a lot of anthrax, but we sure as heck do see a lot of Clostridium difficile. So one of the reasons that it's believed that Clostridium difficile, amongst the many, is causing the problems is that ordinary alcohol decontamination does not work on spores. So that CDT or Clostridium difficile is very difficult to eradicate because it's a spore-forming organism, and those spores are pretty difficult to eradicate chemically. And there are some viruses and some parasites. I'm not going to bore you with the list, but just be aware that that alcohol doesn't kill everything. Now, if you have to choose between hand washing and alcohol, that's fine, but you don't do both. Part of that is that it's just too harsh on your skin, and you guys probably are intuitive about this anyway. If you're alcohol decontaminating, you don't need to wash, and if you're washing, you don't need to alcohol decontaminate. One of the things that's very protective on your skin is your own normal flora. So there are skin organisms that belong there, they're yours, and so there's a competitive disadvantage to new pathogens if you have healthy flora on your skin. So maintaining your own healthy flora is a good thing because it makes it more difficult for a pathogen to take hold. So choose between one or two, and if the hands are not visibly soiled, a lot of the alcohol products have emollients in them, so you don't need the hand lotion. The emollients are there to protect you from some of that harshness. As I said, the dispensers usually provide the correct amount, so you don't have to think about that too hard. And I have just kind of a picture to remind you that alcohol is not like this and go, that there is the spaces in between your fingers and in your jewelry and so forth probably are actually the spots where the microorganisms are going to accumulate. They're not going to accumulate on the open flat surface, so make sure you get down in your nails and in between and so forth, and really do a good job rubbing that gel on. Now in terms of personal dress, I'm curious on the lanyards. Anybody have breakaway lanyards? Yeah, you do. So if you have a lanyard that is not breakaway, it can get caught on things, and I've actually had a lanyard that wasn't, and I got it caught a couple times and nothing bad happened to me. But if you're near a centrifuge or something, that really can catch that lanyard. So if you have a choice, get one of those breakaway lanyards. Avoid some of the things that I said: jewelry, long nails, nail polish, contact lenses. Hair of a certain length should be pulled back, which probably everybody does. I couldn't stand to have my hair in my face when I'm working anyway. I don't know who would do that, but sturdy shoes always. There are shoe covers available if there's a case of a spill or in case you're doing something particularly hazardous. It's recommended that either long pants or skirts are worn to cover the legs, but not drag into the floor. They need to be long enough to cover your legs, but not so long that you mop the floor with them behind you. And all your lab coats should have long sleeves. Rolling up the sleeves is kind of a no-no, and you have to keep them all the way buttoned down because the lab coat doesn't really protect you very well if it's not closed. And a lot of you are probably wearing the fluid-resistant something. Your lab coats are fluid-resistant, so the normal cotton lab coats are great. They're actually more comfortable, but their ability to limit fluid is sparse. The fluid-resistant lab coats, and there's a ton on the market, I find them hot to wear. I don't know how you feel. They're just hotter than the cotton. They can create static, and so they're a little bit of an electrical hazard. But I want to define for you fluid-resistant. Fluid-resistant does not mean you get a spill and then you'll just keep that lab coat on until it's lunchtime. Fluid-resistant means that it's going to resist that fluid to give you enough time to get that lab coat off. And replace it. It's the same thing as a fire door. The fire doors that are rated an hour, 2 hours, and so forth, the rating for those fire doors has nothing to do with containing the fire. It has to do with giving you, this is how long you have to escape, that we're keeping that fire from coming through the door so you can get out. And a fluid-resistant lab coat is similar. So the more grossly contaminated it is, the quicker you should get it off and replace it. The preference, if you have your druthers, is to pick the ones with the knitted cuffs. so that the gloves can come over the knitted cuffs, and then you get a pretty good seal. The gloves won't go over like an open sleeve. The cuffs are what make it so you put on your lab coat, put your glove on, and then pull it down over that knitted cuff. There is, you have to remove lab coat safely just like gloves, making sure that as you're pulling it off, you're only touching the inside that's clean. And when you put it into the laundry, do you guys use disposable or laundry? Laundry, yes. So that the proper way to be doing it is that it's inside out, so that the clean part is on the outside, and that's what you throw into the basket. I didn't want to, there's a very nice YouTube video of exactly how to take a lab coat off that I've got the link there. My husband was laughing. He said, really, you're going to tell people how to take their lab coats off? I mean, he just, what do those people want you up there for? I mean, he was just like sort of flabbergasted, but okay. Should be separate hooks for your street clothes versus your lab coat. That's ideal, so you've got a locker, you've got somewhere for the stuff that's going to be the street clothes, and then you've got a place for your contaminated stuff. But just remember, if you really need full-on fluid resistance for some procedure or another, that requires a plastic apron or something for complete fluid impermeability. Right, so that's kind of the quick and dirty on personal protective equipment. Basic work practices. Things that you already know, that you don't want to have hand-to-face contact. So anytime your hand is going up toward your face, that's probably something you want to avoid. Certainly no smoking, eating, drinking, taking medication, gum and lozenges. Gum and lozenges are an interesting one because the OSHA does not like it for even you to be outside the lab and putting gum or lozenges in your mouth and then coming in, because from their perspective, when they see you in the lab, they don't know whether you did that inside the lab or without. So on the strict interpretation of what OSHA says, no gum, no cough drops, none of that sort of thing.
What medication?
If you have to take medication, you need to step out and do that.
Oh.
Yeah, so if it's just pills and eye drops and other kinds of things. I've seen contact lens wearers have little things in their pockets and things like that. No applying cosmetics, no inserting contact lenses, and obviously no mouth pipetting. So clearly stuff that you should already know. Wear your personal protective equipment properly, button long sleeve lab coat. We all know that you need to have good sturdy shoes that are closed. One of the reasons I have toe and heel is there's a big deal in the kind of the lab safety community about Crocs, because the Crocs had an open, and OSHA finally, I think, came with an examination of Crocs and said having the heel open is not acceptable. So Crocs, not being stupid people, proceeded to then make Crocs with the heel closed in the back. And I have there like no cloth, canvas, or punch, because some of the Crocs kind of have vents. Like, do you know the punching in there? So yeah, the more comfortable it is, the more likely is you can't wear it in the lab. Hair pulled back, no jewelry, and no contaminated clothing outside the lab. Now, personal behavior, when I wrote this last edition of the safety book, I added a section that I didn't have before, because the introduction of tablets and cell phones and so forth has created a whole new, like, okay, here's another no-no for the laboratory. So there's all sort of electronic devices, and a lot of them you put up to your face. So that in the laboratory, if you think that that's basically a contaminated environment, and you're going like this on your cell phone, and then you put up to your face, ugh. And these are objects that you really can't decontaminate. So, and they're very high touch devices. So whatever's going on with your hands is on that tablet, is on that cell phone. So within the laboratory, no personal cell phones, tablets, and so forth. Earbuds have become a no-no, and because of people not being able to hear instructions, and particularly safety instructions. People have music blaring, and they're kind of in their place. They can miss announcements and fire drills and that kind of thing. So the earbuds have become a no-no. I never knew that some people had pets in the lab, like little pet mice or gerbils, or and plants have also become a no-no just because of the organisms that they can harbor. So basically, the fun police have come and told you that you cannot have any fun anymore, and no other unapproved consumer devices. The hospitals have become very leery of blow dryers and radios and so forth, because some of them, if they're old or not particularly high quality, they can start fires. So that it's got to be something that is approved by your biomedical device department, do you have something like that here? No jokes or horseplay, no drugs or alcohol. Avoid working alone in the lab, and this is a big enough place that that is probably never an issue. But in some smaller sites, that is actually a big issue, because you may have one person on the night shift all alone. There was an incident in Salisbury at Purdue where a woman came in early. She had something that she wanted to do, and she was drying some chromatography plates or something in an oven, and she pulled the door open before they were completely dry, and the heated volatile chemical hit the oxygen and it blew up on her. And when the folks came in for day shift, she was in the floor passed out cold. So they had a real big come to Jesus with, okay, so, you know, do we let people work alone? What do we let them do? Do we let them be in here at all? And plan procedures so the safety equipment is ready. So if you are, if you're doing anything that blocks the fire extinguisher, or blocks the eye wash, or is not close to where you need to have that safety equipment, then that's probably not the best idea. And then obviously the last resort is to discipline people that break all of those rules. Word about housekeeping, and this is we all have different levels of neatness that we can tolerate. I can have our kitchen, and I go, man, this is a mess, and my husband will say, what? It looks normal to me. So we all have sort of different levels, but in the laboratory, some of our mess can be hazardous, either from chemicals or biohazards and so forth. So try to keep your work areas uncluttered, decontaminated at the end of the day. And you probably already know to strictly segregate your biohazard trash from your regular trash. And people that are new may not completely know what that is. So is it in a red bag, an orange bag? And the stuff that tends to accumulate is stuff that hasn't been put away, or you'll get back to it. If it's accumulating in walkways, if it's accumulating near fire extinguishers, if it's accumulating near the eye washes or the safety showers, that's a really big problem. So it might just be unsightly in one place, but if it's truly blocking safety equipment in another, then it's got to be picked up, put away, and so forth, because that needs to be kept unobstructed. With regard to labeling, the most dangerous chemical in the lab is the one that you do not know what it is. If you don't know what it is, then you think it might be water, but it might be acid. You have a dilute solution of acid and water are going to look exactly the same thing. So everything should be labeled. Everything should be labeled on the container itself, not on the lid. I fuss at the students about, no, you had this thing and you labeled the lid comes off and is now separate from whatever it is. So on the body, one person's neat handwriting is not so much another person's neat handwriting, but you gotta figure that out. So that there are the things on there that can be read, depending on what your laboratory wants, the identity of the substance, the concentration, the date received, made or expires, any cautionary statement. Most people are going to assume, without labeling, that it's okay, that once you walk into a medical laboratory, you've got all kinds of biohazards there, and that's just, you don't have to have a biohazard sticker on every one of them. But chemicals, maybe not so much. If you're at a loss, there are some very nice sample labels that you can buy. So I wanted to take just the couple minutes that we have left and talk about this idea that laboratories and places of business need to have what's been called a safety culture, which is a little bit different than what maybe you have been used to. This is what happens in the CQI process, that there's a review of lab quality, standard operating procedures, people are trained, and then it's reviewed for incidences and accidents. So that middle area is kind of what you're used to thinking about. And the input on either side is lab safety, rules and regulations, but then we've got all this other competing stuff. We've got regulations for stuff for patient safety, the testing process, lab administrations, budgets, materials management, so forth. So here you are in the middle in the laboratory that you're being pounded by all of this extra stuff, and you are just trying to do your job. You're just trying to make your procedures, you're trying to review accidents and so forth. And we have been very rule and regulation driven. So that if this is the rule, this is the regulation, this is what we do. And we haven't really thought about creating a culture where we're thinking about safety without having OSHA come in and say, this is what you need to do now. We're used to just kind of being told what to do as opposed to using our own noggins. So that people that are at the level of doing the work, which is you guys, are actually the ones that are the eyes and the ears to be able to say, you know what, these gloves that you bought, they just don't fit very well. I feel awkward when I have them. Can we get different gloves? Or these labels that you made aren't sticking, or whatever it might be. So that the people who are making the decisions are not going to know what might need to be improved without your input. So in a safety culture, that input is seen as desirable and valuable, and that it is every bit as much of your job to help everybody get to the place being safe as opposed to just following the rules. Incidents in a perfect world are seen as an opportunity for improvement, not for blame or punishment. So if something went awry, then what can we learn from that? It's not an opportunity to say, oh, Kevin, he did it again. We told him that he needed to do whatever. It is an opportunity to say, what were the factors that caused that to happen to Kevin? Because it might happen to somebody else as well. So it's continuous, it's proactive, it's not reactive, and it involves everybody. So it's an equal priority in the overall part of the organization, and that means you. Now, what are the barriers to it? It requires participation from everyone to be fully effective. The safest way to do something may not be the easiest or the cheapest. Ooh, that's a big one. That's a big one. And I gotta tell you, we had gloves that my faculty hated. The ones they liked were double in cost. Now, they don't have to worry about the budget I do. We don't have a big budget to begin with. I sucked it up and I bought the gloves that the faculty wanted, because that's what you do if, and you want to make sure the students are compliant and so forth. So that you've got to give that input even if it's not something people want to hear. Fear of retaliation if you disclose unsafe practices, so that's a barrier, and a tendency to blame or punish people rather than evaluate it in a no-fault way. So it's got to be cultural. You've got to believe that your managers, if you come to them with a situation saying, no, this is not quite optimal, can we do something different, are not going to blame you, fuss you, they're going to fuss at you, that they're going to take that input as valuable. So when we think about medical laboratories, we know that our work is time sensitive, we know it's critical. We know that we're under pressure to hold down costs, but to continue to deliver that same high level of service. Very difficult to do that simultaneously. We know that we are understaffed a lot, and the understaffing causes you to do the things that cause a car accident that we talked right at the beginning. You have accidents close to your house, why? Because you've driven that road a million times, and you're thinking, okay, I gotta run by the store and get milk, I gotta pick up the kid at soccer. You're distracted and you're not paying attention to what you're doing. So you may rush, you may multitask, and you may have unsafe or poor work quality or cut the corners with respect to safety. Overstaffing is costly, and every place I have ever worked would rather understaff than overstaff. Hands down, every place I've ever worked will understaff more than they overstaff. So it is hard to sometimes balance those priorities. Accident analysis is an important piece of this. It's important for you guys, if you think you have an allergic reaction or there's been some sort of incident, to report it, and I really hope and pray that the culture here is to use it as a learning opportunity, because guess what? It can happen again. If it happened to you, it can happen to somebody else. And if there's something that can be fixed, it should be. Punishment or termination needs to be the absolute last resort, and that's part of this idea of creating the culture. So the analysis includes not just what went wrong, but what went right. Did this fire happen, but everybody knew where the fire extinguisher was, everybody evacuated the way they were supposed to, whatever it might be. And then correction plans are put in, and with the worker input and preferences, again, those people that are actually on the front lines. So following up, what's the root cause for an accident, doing training, timelines, and so forth, and verify that it's the plan has corrected whatever the incident is. And you guys have that in place with your CQI, that you're kind of being proactive with some of this. And so this idea that I was asked to come and sort of reinvigorate putting safety as a piece into that CQI, that if we need to hold costs down on the gloves, or whatever it might be, then fine, let's try to hold the cost down on the gloves, but we need to make sure we have worker input. We need to make sure that the people who are actually doing it have agreed that these gloves are good and safe and so forth. So the management style has to then be inclusive and valuing the honesty and the communication. And so I want to be real respectful of that 45 minutes. I think I did it. So that's all that I have. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to take any questions if you have them. If not, I'm going to drive back to the shore and try to get ahead of the big bridge traffic. Did you have?
Yeah, so I know you said that the gloves should be the last
Yes.
piece to take off from PPE.
No, the first piece. It's the last piece to put
To
on.
put on.
It's
and
the first piece to
take
come off.
And wash, and
Wash
then
your
wash your
hands.
hands. Then you take off the lab coats you're putting it in.
Yeah, and if you're gonna have the gloves off, then you pull from the inside. So you're pulling on the clean area. And on the video, it actually shows where you pull this way so that your hand is underneath the clean part of the sleeve, so that your clean hand only touches clean things. That when you're doing PPE, you want your clean hands only touching clean surfaces. And the assumption is the inside is clean and the outside is dirty.
Makes sense.
So I'm very curious if any of you have thoughts about the 30 minutes, changing gloves. Chris and I talked about that a little bit, and it wasn't to sandbag you, it was to make sure that I gave the talk that you guys needed. And we're both curious as to whether or not that sort of naturally happens, that after 30, 45 minutes, I would just, if I were working shifts, I kind of think I would like write a time on my glove when I put it in, just to see, like, you know, in an ordinary day, how long would I stay in gloves? Because when I'm teaching, sometimes I'll be running a long lab and I'll think, man, I've been in these gloves a while, but not really how long I've been in there. So 30 minutes sounds like a lot, but I tend to tear my gloves or do something every 30 to 45 minutes anyway and have to change. So,
Or they get stained,
They get stained,
or
yeah.
you put a hole in it, or they start ripping.
yeah, I don't know what I do. I tend to rip. I don't know. I must be rough. Well, I know you guys have to get back because this was kind of your lunch break. I apologize for interrupting for your lunch break, but she's got a whole bit of sun here, so. Anybody who's still hungry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.